What sort of firepower did they have, and what was the nature of battle in the high seas?
Well, they had plenty of firepower to capture an unarmed merchant ship. The Alabama carried, I believe, I have to remember now, I think 11 guns, 10 or 11 guns. The Florida almost the same. The Alabama actually sank one naval ship, the Hatteras, which it outgunned in January of 1863. It went hunting for a weak Union warship and found the Hatteras and sank it.
I just saw that the Hatteras is going to be photographed in 3D. They're sending down cameras to,
Really?
to
I didn't know
the
that.
Hatteras
That's
now,
fascinating.
and we're going
So
to
they
have our
found it.
first. Yeah, we have our first photographs of them
Yeah.
coming up fairly soon. I think they said by January.
It's in the Gulf of Mexico, not far away from Galveston. So yeah, they were able to find
Talking
it.
about Mexico, Matamoros was involved in our war, was it not?
Well, Matamoros is right across the Rio Grande River from Brownsville, Texas. It's in Mexico, and suddenly, with the beginning of the American Civil War, there was all kinds of foreign trade going in and out of Matamoros, Mexico. A neutral port under international law. American blockade ships could not stop ships going into a neutral port, even though they knew that these ships were carrying goods for the Confederacy, which would be transshipped across the Rio Grande and hauled through Texas and then into the other Confederate states, and cotton was being shipped out of there. Finally, the Union Navy got so fed up with this that they started stopping ships on the high seas that they suspected had false papers and that were carrying goods for the Confederacy. And one of these ships they stopped in the Caribbean was the Peterhoff, a British merchant ship, which was carrying military goods to Matamoros with false papers. And this case went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, which actually ratified the right of the Navy to stop a ship if it could prove to the satisfaction of an admiralty court that the papers were false and that the goods were actually intended for the Confederacy. That case created something of a precedent that the British drew on a half-century later when they stopped American merchant ships carrying goods to the Netherlands, which was neutral in World War I, that the British determined were destined for Germany. And so that particular precedent came home to roost 50 years after the Supreme Court's decision in the case of the Peterhoff.
Let's switch over to the Mississippi. What was the import of the Mississippi Squadron? And I know they were doing more than... there must have been a great deal of pressure from the states that bordered the Mississippi and from the businessmen behind the politicians who asked to have that opened up to keep commerce going. There must have been a great deal of pressure to keep that open.
Well, there was an enormous amount of pressure from what was then called the Northwestern states, states that border the Mississippi River, Illinois, and its tributaries, the Ohio River, the
Indiana,
and
also.
so on, Indiana and Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and so on, to reopen the Mississippi River to the products of Midwestern farms, which of course was completely blocked up by the beginning of the Civil War. And that created something of an economic depression in the farm country of the old Northwest. So that was one of the reasons for the determination to regain control of the Mississippi River, and that's a process that began I suppose, primarily in the spring of 1862, when one Union fleet coming up from the south captured New Orleans, and then part of that fleet went all the way up to Vicksburg in the spring and summer of 1862, at the same time that another Union fleet, then called the Western Flotilla, later renamed the Mississippi Squadron, was working its way down the Mississippi River after having gained control of much of the Tennessee and Cumberland River in the campaigns that captured Forts Henry and Donelson in February of 1862. And these two fleets met at Vicksburg in July of 1862. The Western Flotilla, having worked its way down, captured Memphis, and then moved on down to meet Farragut's fleet at Vicksburg. But Vicksburg in the summer of 1862 proved too tough a nut for the Navy alone to capture, and there weren't enough Army troops, and the ones that were on hand were all getting sick in the summer of 1862. More than half of them were out of action, half of the 3,000 troops. So, and the Mississippi River was falling, threatening to maroon Farragut's deepwater, saltwater fleet for months, if not longer. So finally they left in July 1862, and then the Western Flotilla retreated back up to Helena, Arkansas, and it had to wait until 1863 and U.S. Grant and David Dixon Porter and the Mississippi Squadron to capture Vicksburg in July of '63.
You mentioned disease. Was there as much disease percentage-wise in the Navy among the sailors as there was in the Army, and the deaths that occurred?
There was for the River Navy, the Brownwater Navy, as it was called, the Mississippi Squadron, and when it was in the river, Farragut's fleet, suffered pretty much the same level of disease morbidity and disease mortality as the Army. But on saltwater, no. The blockade ships were much healthier than the Army because they are free from all of the problems that affected armies and naval forces on land and in the malarial swamps and so on.
What about the guerrillas that were up and down the Mississippi, and who were they, and what part did the Navy have in trying to stop them?
The Confederacy relied more on guerrilla warfare than we've traditionally recognized, and a lot of these guerrillas attacked Union shipping on the rivers that the Union Navy had gained control of, like the Mississippi and the Tennessee River. They were local troops, home guard type troops. Many of them were mounted. They did have some artillery. They would hide along the banks of the river, and if a merchant ship came along, or if a lightly armored naval ship came along and they had artillery, they would fire on it to try to interrupt commerce, to try to stop the troop ships and supply ships from supplying Army troops and Navy troops. They became a real problem. And especially after the capture of Vicksburg, now Admiral David Dixon Porter, who was the commander of the Mississippi Squadron, had to spend most of his time and energy on keeping the rivers open from guerrilla attacks.
Were they hanged as quickly as they could be found?
If they could be caught, they would be dealt with frequently, pretty summarily. I think there was a lot more of that than gets into the records.
Mm-hmm. Your next book?
Maybe my next book. Actually, Dan, I think it's Dan Sutherland, in a book, The Savage War on Guerrilla Warfare, has done a pretty good job on talking about the guerrilla attacks on the Navy as well as on the Union Army.
I'm showing a song sheet now, the Monitor and Merrimack. I mean, the battle is iconic, and we're already 45 minutes in, and we haven't even gotten to the Monitor and the Merrimack. Is there anything new to add to the story? I mean, it's been gone over so much. You did say how the Monitor didn't have enough explosive powder, and the Merrimack didn't have the correct shells on it. Part of the problems they each had, and the winner is still debated, but the impact was profound.
Well, when I've told people that I have done a book on the naval war, they will often reply Gee, that's the Monitor and Merrimack, isn't it? And that's the only thing they've ever heard about the Navy in the Civil War is the Monitor and Merrimack, which of course is a misnomer in the case of the Merrimack because the Confederates named it the Virginia, but even some Southerners continued to call it the Merrimack. There isn't much new that can be said about that. There are dozens and dozens of books about these two ships and their titanic struggle on March 9th in 1862 in Hampton Roads. Yes, those two ships could have done a lot more damage to each other if they had had the proper armament. But the Monitor was so new, it hadn't even been able to try out its guns yet, that they didn't want to put the full powder charge in. Later it turned out those guns could have taken a full powder charge, but they had only a half powder charge. And the Virginia had come out that day intending to attack the wooden warships, so explosive shells rather than the bolts or iron balls that could have damaged the Monitor. And as a consequence, they fought each other to a draw. I think it would be fair to call it a stalemate in this iconic first battle between the ironclads in the history of the world.
Brought Lincoln down a few weeks later, though.
Yes, Lincoln came down the first week of May, 1862, to try. I think he came down to try to get McClellan to get moving. And when he got there, McClellan actually had started only because the Confederates had finally pulled out of Yorktown. But Lincoln actually put some spirit into both John Wool's Army troops and the Navy that was there to capture Norfolk. And when Norfolk fell, the Virginia, which had a 22-foot draft, even when they unloaded everything from it, it still had about a 20-foot draft, and that was too deep to get up the James River. So they had to blow it up. Mm-hmm. And Lincoln deserves part of the credit for goosing both the Army and the Navy to do something when he came down there. Commander-in-Chief is on the spot. This is the one time when he actually does issue some orders directly to the Navy, or through Captain Goldsborough. But Goldsborough was kind of he weighed 300 pounds and was as slow as you might imagine from that kind of a situation.